Maybe it'll go live here. All right, so we're going to try to wrap up our discussion of Paul Ray. He's quite convinced that he's made a really, really solid case for the fact that it's obvious that we don't have free will and that whatever choices we make, they're a part of the unbroken chain of causal determination underneath the umbrella of the universal principle of causality. And now that he's shown how true that is, he has to move on to another question, which is, how is it that it doesn't seem this way to us? What accounts for the fact that we don't all just understand how right he is and we've all instinctively understood it? So it's called ignorance of the causation of our actions. And he says, even though it is true what he said, that all of our actions are determined by whatever the state of the universe was 1 second after the Big Bang, it seems as though our actions are undetermined, that we are free to act however we may. To what are we to look for an explanation of this impression, this illusion of freedom? The answer is that we are not aware of the causes of our desires, our wills. And so we presume that they come from nowhere and are an explanation in themselves. Okay, simple. Our wills make our choices, make our actions, but those wills are caused and they're just a part of the causal chain. But because we don't know what causes us to will what we will, we think it just is a prime mover. It's just coming at, ex nihilo. All right, because we know not the causes of our behaviors, we imagine they could have been otherwise than they were. And so we have this illusion of freedom. We can see that the illusion of freedom emerges in this way, in the way of being our assumption due to the lack of knowledge regarding the causal factors which are behind our actions, by looking at when we use this phrase, I could have done otherwise. This is something philosophers often do, is they, in order to try to get clarity about concepts, they often say, well, concepts are things that people are using, so let's look at how we're using them, and maybe that can give us some insight into what the concepts actually mean. Not to say that we're always using them correctly, but it's a field of something that philosophers will often examine. All right. So we use it to refer to things where we know the least about what went into our actions. So I picked up the egg on the left instead of the egg on the right, but I could have done the opposite. We never say I picked up the egg on the left instead of murdering my neighbor. We know enough about our motivations and the realities in the world which bring them about to keep us from feeling inclined to think that we would commit a murder. But we do not know if the other egg was slightly closer or looked a little bit better in the light, or whatever else went into why we chose the egg on the left and the egg on the right. Your motivations are the cause of your actions, but they are themselves caused. In trivial matters, then, the illusion of freedom, of being able to have done otherwise, comes from not having access to the factors that went into determining our desires and choices. In serious matters, it is different. In serious matters, we are aware of the differing forces which go into our choices. But we are still ignorant to the way in which each one weighs against and wars against the others, so that the ultimate outcome still seems to us to emerge from nothing but the choice we made, when in reality the various weights of the different inclinations worked out the way that they had to at the time and at that place, and so they fully account for why we chose what we chose, and they determined that choice. All right, so he says there's two categories of actions, right? In one action, what goes into why I made choice A instead of choice B is so trivial, and I'm unaware of it, and so I just assume that my choice itself was the originating factor, right? I don't know why I chose. I don't know why I chose the egg on the left versus the egg on the right. I'm sitting at the table and I have to pick up an egg from a bowl of eggs. Why did I choose this one versus that one? Well, he says there's some reason, and it's not due to your infinite will and your ability to just originate something new in the universe. It just has to do with, how your arm was extended and how, which one was closer, which one looked better, or whatever, and how hungry you were. And so you don't really know what went into it. And so you just assume it was, your will. That's the most you know about it, is that that's what you wanted. You don't know why you wanted it, but there were reasons why you wanted it. And then there's another category of actions, really important ones, like why I sold my house today or why I married this girl instead of that girl, where we say to ourselves, oh, I know my motivations very well, right? It's, I sold the house because I wanted to move out of this town and because I needed some more money. And I was hoping, like, we know what's motivating us in those circumstances. However, there's always like a war of different motivations. I could have waited another year and maybe gotten a better deal on the house, or I could have maybe postponed another day for some reason, right? So I don't know why exactly at this moment I made the decision to sign the papers and sell my house. And he says, well, wait a minute. In that case, you do know all of the factors that are relevant to this monumentous and big decision in your life. However, it seems like a free decision to you because what you don't know is how each one is weighed, right? So he talks about, imagine mapping out your psyche so that you can see a mound of reason here and a statue of reason there. And the very clear ideas will be brightly colored and the very heavy ones will be much larger. And you can sort of do the physics of saying, well, in this situation, this one's clearly going to win because it outweighs the others. But we don't have access to any of that sort of information. And so again, we have this illusion that it's just because it's what I wanted to do, rather than, obviously, he says, the result of all of those different factors and how they warred against each other and weighed against each other. And they were weighing and warring that way, not because of things you chose, but just because those are the circumstances as they were, and they were outside of yourself. And so you're not any more free in a decision like that. Okay. Because we do not see the causes of our desires, sometimes at all, and sometimes only incompletely, our choices seem to us free. Let's stop there. What do you guys think about that argument? This is his argument for why it seems like we're free, even though we're not. I know that most of us here were expressing a dissatisfaction with how well he made the case that we're not free in the first place. But we're going to have to put that behind us for a moment just to engage with it. Suppose we're sure that we're not free. Is this a good explanation for why we imagine we are when we're not?
I think he did well in kind of expressing these subtleties and like kind of painting a picture that even if his final conclusion isn't completely convincing, I think that he does a fairly good job of sort of showing his argument, or just painting the picture, basically kind of setting the scene, like shedding light on these things that I in the past I've kind of been vaguely aware of or vaguely thought about, but to actually think about them clearly in the way that he describes them, I think, in addition to some of his other points, I think, altogether, to me, I felt like he did a good job of at least appreciating determinism. I don't have to accept his conclusions,
sure,
or, accepting, being a hard determinist, but I think that the best thing that he's done, in my opinion, through his writing here was just appreciating the force of determinism. That to whatever extent they exist, whether they just take a rule or like a total rule. But I think even a libertarian should even they should appreciate the forces of determinism. I think he did a decent job through, putting a spotlight on the subtleties like that.
Yeah, it's quite impressive how committed he is to this idea and how willing he is to work it out, to see what all the consequences are. Instead of just saying he believes it, he really, takes it to its conclusions. And I also think that in this section, I agree with you that he did a pretty good job of making a case. I think there's two ways to read this section. One is, imagine all his arguments for determinism were in the previous three sections. This is just an added explanation for some feature of why we make the mistake, in which case there's little to argue with. However, if what he's trying to do here is make another case for determinism by arguing against a counter argument against it, right? The illusion of free will. It seems like we're free, and so if he's doing extra work for determinism here, he seems to me, I'm not saying he's right or saying he's wrong, but he seems to me to be doing exactly what he was doing before, which is assuming things to be the case, to give a just so story where he's describing like, well, if I could map it all out, you would see how right I am. Well, but you can't, and you didn't. So you didn't really get to your conclusion by mapping it all out and realizing it was the case. You just gave a really, really good description of the perspective of determinism and something that you would sort of have to think is the case and how you could think it through if you were a determinist already. At least that's how it seems to me. I don't know if that's how it strikes you guys. Path, did you unmute?
Yeah, well, I agree with what you guys said. I think he did a pretty good job of trying to explain his, determinism and his position regarding it. Enough to where a person who is more libertarian type minded could see the possibility of determinism in more areas that they previously did. I think.
Yeah, I think
like
that's
it's
right.
crossed my mind since we. So for me personally, since we've been reading this a little bit, there are times when I wonder, well, could that be the unseen causes that are affecting that? And so something I didn't consider as much before. So he has been somewhat effective for me personally, I would say.
I'm glad you said that. I think that you're correct about that. I think that if you come into this argument and you think, well, of course, I lean towards libertarianism, I think determinism must be wrong. By the time you're done reading Paul Ray, you think, oh, wow, there's a stronger case here than I thought there was. I feel like that's what you're saying. And I think that, he did a good job of that. But part of the strongest part, I would think that the strongest parts of his arguments are the fact that he's not, sometimes we think about a debate like determinism versus free will, whether or not we're inclined to determinism or towards free will, libertarianism or towards anything else. If we haven't read the arguments against our position, we can tend to have sort of a cartoonish view of how strong they would be in our minds. And when you read Paul Ray, you realize, oh, he's not saying there's no such thing as choice. Of course there are choices. They're determined. There's just no free choices, right? And so if you come in thinking, well, the only way a person could be a determinist is to deny choice, but I'm making choices all the time. I choose to lift my right arm. I choose to do this, and that proves how free I am. It's like, well, you can think that if you haven't read a determinist before, but now we've read a determinist, and he says, of course you made a choice. You could have done nothing else but to make exactly that choice. That choice was determined. And so willpower and choices are not meaningless terms to Paul Ray. They mean something. They're just a part of the unbroken causal chain. They're not divine and prime movers and outside the universal principle of causality. That's the only point he's really trying to make. But that point really requires him to say there's no such thing as freedom. And so I like that you said that before we read him, it's easier to think that there's not such a good argument here, but he's done a pretty good job, I think, of making this argument. So yeah, thank you for that. I think I agree with you on that. All right. So let's do this one discussion question here. Unless there's something else you guys want to say. If either of you want to interject, don't wait for me to call on you. Just unmute and start talking, and we'll have a conversation. There's no raising hands or anything. I don't want to move on too quickly, but if not, here's what I'll say. All right, so here's the thing to think about. Paul Ray would likely agree with which of the following statements? So we're going to check off every one that he might agree with. If we could have knowledge of all the subconscious workings of our mind, make an account of all the trivial physical components of our environment, and have access to all the causal links leading to our actions, none of our actions would seem free to us anymore. And we would be liberated from the illusion of living free from a causal nexus determining our actions.
True.
Yeah, it's insulting to ask that question. Obviously, he thinks that one, right? Okay, let's try the next one. Paul Ray would agree with this, yes or no? The more I know about why I made a certain decision over another, the less I feel the illusion that choice is a mysterious freedom. So the more I know about the causes of my decision, right, the factors that go into the choice I make, the less I am belaboring under an illusion of freedom. So would he think that if I know less about what's motivating me, I'll have more of an illusion of freedom, but if I know more about what's motivating me, I'll have less of an illusion of freedom?
I'll go with true.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think he thinks that they're related. Is that right, Path?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, okay, it's too obvious. All right. Acts of will are randomly generated, and so they do not count as part of your free will. Does he think that your desire for the egg on the left versus the egg on the right is just a random thing that has no explanation, but it's certainly not your free will?
I'll go with false.
Yeah.
I don't think that's true.
Yeah, that's right. I think that, his whole argument is based on the idea that it isn't random. You could figure out why you did things if you had access to knowledge that you don't have. So it can't be. So obviously he can't believe in randomness as a result, as a part of the universe in any way, actually. All right. Everything that comprises your motivations for an action are themselves ultimately the cause of things outside yourself. So everything that goes into your choice that you make is ultimately outside of you. These are maybe all too obvious. All right. So go ahead.
What do you think, though? Is it some of the causes within us as well? Is it all external causes, or I didn't catch that part right?
Yeah, I would actually go with false. I guess it depends. I guess it's kind of like.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. So maybe it's not so obvious, and maybe I worded it badly, but yeah, okay, good. So obviously he thinks some of your choice is based on your inclinations, your temperament, your nature, your genetic makeup, those types of things. Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
And those are inside yourself. They're not outside yourself. They are you.
Sure.
Right.
They're a part of you, within you, those kind of things. Yeah.
Yes. So then the whole thing hinges on the word ultimately. You didn't choose your nature. You didn't choose your parents or your grandparents or your DNA or what kind of inclinations you would have or what past events shaped your current character, right? So because you didn't choose any of those things, ultimately, the word ultimately really is the key here. Ultimately, you can trace all those things back, right? So yes, there are links that are you that are a part of why you're making the choices you're making. But ultimately, those things go back to 1 second after the Big Bang determined all of it.
Okay.
But yeah, without the word ultimately, he definitely doesn't think that you're just a robot that doesn't think things or feel things or have a will or a desire. He thinks you have all of those things, but they're all determined by things ultimately outside yourself. Okay, in important matters, we have no idea what motivates us. We imagine we know why we do what we do, but we just make these things up to explain our behavior after the fact. Does Paul Ray think that in important matters, we have no idea what's motivating us?
I would say false.
I agree.
Same here.
Yeah, okay. I agree. Yeah, no, he thinks the more important the matter, the more likely we know what's going into our decision making, but the less we know about the complicated ways that those different motivations are interacting or something, right? I mean, I suppose he might say something, we're just going to speculate here. He might say something about a very important decision that was made with a very simple, singular motivation. It's like, well, that would be not a challenge to his position, right? Let's say, let's just, Paul Ray loves the examples of him committing murder. I don't know why. Let's use a different example. Let's say you come home and you find a loved one has been murdered and you see the murderer standing over the loved one. You attack the murderer. afterwards you don't say, I wonder why I did that. Right? It's sort of like, okay, in that case, the map of decision making is one big lump and nothing else matters. And that would be very obviously proving that your decision was determined by the situation you were in and all of that, right? So it's only the complicated ones, or the ones where there's differing factors that are warring against each other, where we even have the illusion of free will in the first place. I mean, that would be the way he would interpret that. Okay, last one. If we knew how much weight each of our various impulses had on us at any time, we would know why and how they determined the choices we ended up making.
True.
Yeah, I'd say true.
Yeah, I agree. That was interesting compared to the first three quizzes. I think that whatever. Let's move on. Okay, so in the next section, so is there anything else anybody wants to talk about? His egg example. There were some interesting things there about his picture of a map of motivations, where he can put in a plastic form everything that's pulling you one way versus another, and how clearly those things matter and how heavy they are to you at a certain time.
Can I ask you guys a question?
Yeah, please.
Which argument did you find the most interesting or convincing? I will start. I think the absent-minded type of actions that he I forget what part, but just you're going through life, you're thinking about something else, and you're on autopilot type of thing. And I mean, how many times have you? I mean, for instance, me. I mean, I've just driven like 100 miles before on the freeway without even paying attention. No cars, just kind of autopilot, just keep between the lines, listening to something else, thinking about days gone by, that kind of thing. But I still wound up going where I intended to go. It's crossed my mind a little bit, and it's somewhat of an example, although it's for kind of weak, I guess, not totally convincing, I should say. But,
well, that's interesting. No, that's interesting. So it's important to understand that libertarians, right, the people on the opposite side of this argument, they don't think everything you do is free. They don't think everything you do is intentional. They don't think everything in the universe is just made up by creative people in all instances. They think, oh yeah, a lot of what you do is just rote and robotic, and you're not, really thinking about it, and it doesn't really matter and all of that. And they think, if you're overwhelmed by passion, you might do something that isn't a product. Certain libertarians think for a decision to be free, it has to be rational. It has to be something you chose to do for rational reasons. Even your passions would enslave you, and so that wouldn't count as freedom, and all sorts of different positions. So libertarians usually are not absolutists about freedom. They don't think everything is free, or that every decision a person makes is free. So they could agree that, you can turn off your brain and just go on rote or something like that, or a robotic. So I don't know. That is an interesting thing for him to explore, though, isn't it? I'm trying to remember why he brought that up. Can somebody remind me why he brought up that idea? Path had to go, but he'll be right back. He's listening, he says. All right. Determinism is... Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me at the moment, but I did think likewise. I think it was the example he used of somebody raising their right hand over their left hand, or it was something. It was one of these examples that I did, similar to Path. I started thinking about myself. I was like, well, why am I scratching my chin right now? I do this often. I never even thought about it, and it makes you think. It does make you think. Things we take for granted that we think are random, but there's going back to the Big Bang. There's a reason for it, which is kind of mind-boggling to even think about.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible it goes back to the Big Bang. I remember there's a really great novel called Immortality by Milan Kundera, and it's a really fantastic novel. He he wrote a lot of masterpieces, and then this was sort of his masterpiece of masterpieces. It's a really great book. And in the beginning, oddly enough, he does something very creative in this book where he puts the author of the book in the book. So he starts the book by saying, I'm sitting by a pool thinking about the main character of the book that I'm going to write here, right? So he's sort of talking to you, or the narrator is a character as an author that he's created within his novel. In any case, what's great about that is that if you try to think rationally about it throughout the course of the book, it ends up just dissolving your ability to think about that question at all, which makes the book more real in the sense that you can't consider it a book anymore because all the questions of author's intent and stuff become impossible to contemplate. It's one of the really cool things he accomplished. But in any case, he starts the book and he says, I'm sitting by the pool. I'm waiting for this professor friend of mine to show up. At the end of the book, the professor's another character in the book. So you can tell, that's where it sort of blows your mind with being able to ask questions that you sometimes might ask about authorship. In any case, he's waiting for this professor to come and he says, and I see this woman in the pool and she gives a gesture. She waves over her shoulder at somebody. And in that moment, in that gesture was born the main character of my story. And then he starts talking about gestures, things like thoughtless actions and things we do of habit. Like Paul Ray talks about, we lean on our hand on the right or the left when we're thinking and we don't know why. And all of this, he says, there are far more people than there are gestures, in the world. So, it's sort of like the Jungian idea that ideas have people rather than people have ideas. He says basically gestures have people rather than people have gestures. And so why did I bring all that up? So what's interesting to consider is like, okay, Paul Ray's thinking of us as basically robots, and we've got a few things that are available to us, right? I could have chosen the egg on the left. I could have chosen the egg on the right. I could have leaned on my left hand versus leaning on my right hand while I was contemplating something. I couldn't have flown to the moon. I couldn't have burst into flames by, free choice or something, whatever. There's plenty of things I can't do, but there's plenty of things that seem like possibilities to me. But the only things that happen are the things that are sufficiently caused to happen. That's his universal principle of causality. And it's interesting to think of us as robots inside of a simulation where we have available to us certain pre-coded thoughts and actions and gestures and things like that. And there's fewer of those than there are people. So we're sharing them, we're borrowing them from each other, we're spreading them like diseases or something like that. It's also similar, obviously, to the Scott Adams determinism position, which we'll have to talk more about later, but is super interesting. Okay, let's go to section 5. Determinism is inconsistent with judgments of moral responsibility. So this was the purpose. I'm not reading the passage, obviously. These are just the notes on it. But this is sort of, from what we know of Paul Ray, he's trying to make this point. So we can understand that his determinism, his commitment to determinism really is to lead up to this. This is the grabber, man. This is the big thing he's hoping to get to. Okay, Paul. The conclusion is obvious, he says. Most people don't think about this, but of those few of us who do, most come to the conclusions that the ultimate causation of an individual's actions are outside themselves. The ultimate causation is outside the individual. And so it is inappropriate and philosophically an error to say that someone should be punished for whatever they have done, or praised for that matter. However, all is not lost. Strictly speaking, blame and merit should become nonsense words to us. However, we may still find some actions like helping the needy as agreeable and other actions like murder as disagreeable. We may even say, I admire that individual and wish I was more like him, for I am impressed by his behaviors in these circumstances. Perhaps we could even say, it is good that we punish the murderer, as a deterrent to weigh on the minds of other would-be murderers, that they might take our punishment into account when the various motivations that determine their actions are being weighed. None of this is nonsense, but strictly speaking, people do what they are determined to do. Now here's a question. Is that a significant point? I guess what I mean is, there's this cliche thing people say, and I hate saying things like that, but is there a difference here? Is that he's saying, the idea that we have of moral culpability seems to be rescued there by what he says is a reasonable thing to consider. And yet he seems to think that he's getting rid of a very popular misconception, a delusion that we all think that people are bad or good, blameworthy or praiseworthy, when in reality they're not. They're just doing things that we like and admire and would hope to be like, or that we hate and detest and would hope to minimize by creating negative consequences for. Is there something he's getting rid of, or is that just what we all assumed, or is his argument so persuasive and powerful that we're only left with his ideas, and we used to live in a world where we believed in something beyond that?
I think it's just a huge point that it at least contemplating it. Like, I think people should at least contemplate it, whether we accept it or not, because I mean, it's only the complete reformation of the whole justice system. So it's like a kind of a huge point. And when I first started thinking about the debate between free will and determinism, like, this was, sort of the first thing I thought of before I realized this was like, a point that naturally comes up in the conversation. But, it's pretty profound to think that like the way that we, would treat criminals would just be completely different. And I think it's easy to have a knee-jerk response to it and think that that's crazy. But I don't know. I just think that it's worth considering, what that means. I don't know. Like, as far as like a normative position, I don't know what I would prescribe. Only that I just think it's healthy for people to put this factor into account. I just have a lot of thoughts on it because, really, Paul Ray. I have to ask first if, because I wasn't sure, because I know you had mentioned it before. If there is a larger writing that like, are there more writings of Paul Ray? Okay, because I was like,
yes, this is an excerpt.
Okay, because I was like, surely this is a starting point, because I have a ton of thoughts on this issue, and like one of them I think about. I'm not 100% on this, but I believe that in India, people who are in poverty are viewed as culpable, like they're not viewed with the compassion, from what I've heard, because of their Hinduic beliefs of karma. So like, their karmic beliefs are that, basically whatever people get, they have coming, kind of a thing. And I don't, this was years ago that I've heard that. I don't, know if that's true to this day, but it's an interesting to think about, because I actually think determinism might do the opposite. My thinking is, I think it will actually be different for each person's conception of it, like how it materializes. I think will be different. But for me, my thinking when I first started thinking about this issue was that my thinking is like, the realization of determinism is like the beginning of compassion. Like, that's because we're basically like prisoners of fate. Like, we're prisoners of these causes, basically. And even if determinism, like, even if hard determinism isn't the truth, surely, like, it accounts for a massive, like, for an overwhelming, it's an overwhelming factor of reality. And so we're at least to some degree prisoners of circumstance or fate or whatever, or determinism. And so what I think that should do really is make people more compassionate. Like, in my opinion, like, if people knew that not everything is just completely up to free will. And the only example I can give is, I know somebody who is, and feel free to pull me off this tangent because I just have a lot of like thoughts on it. But basically, I know somebody who is, they're like a fundamentalist Christian, and this is nothing against fundamentalist Christians, but so he has kind of a rigid worldview, and he insists, when we talk, because we talk about this sometimes, and he insists that what he's sure of is that everybody has free will. And and he would insinuate that kind of like everybody has the same degree of free will. And I was trying to like point out that I don't think that, like, even if we all have some degree of free will, we surely don't all have the same degree of free will. And it's just also to note that he is not a very compassionate person. And I think that it stems from this belief that everybody has the same degree of free will, and every choice is like every choice has the condemnation of hell, like, just waiting for it. And I think that it's I'm not saying that, like, you can't believe that. It's just that I think it gives a little more depth and color to the world to account for deterministic forces like this. And I'm certainly like anything but a bleeding heart liberal, but I'm surely not anywhere near that. But I do think that what the ramifications are of this issue of like moral culpability. I just think it's something that everybody could it would be great if everybody thought about things in this way, just at least taking account of it.
Okay, good. You bring up two really important points there. So first of all, in the modern fad of legal theory today is actually nothing like natural law theory. It's very, very much in tune with Paul Ray and what you're talking about. So that doesn't mean every lawyer and every judge thinks that way, but I'm not saying I agree with it either, but if you think about reasons for punishment in law, you've got, we want to get back at the bad guy, or we want to deter people from doing bad things, or, we want to set the universe right and weigh the scales back the way they should have been, or we want to rehabilitate the person. And so the punishment helps train them. Of all of those, basically the one that's taken most seriously today is just the deterrent-based one. Most, again, it's not like they won the debate philosophically, and there won't be a different fad coming in the future. I'm not trying to create the impression that the question's been settled. I'm just saying that today, typically people say, okay, show me what harm is being caused to justify the making of the law against that thing, and show me what's necessary to, we have to imprison this person or they're going to cause other harm. And so, deterrence and, keeping people safe from potential repeat offenders and things like that mean they're the meat of most legal arguments, as opposed to, we must punish the evildoer to purify the land because God is watching type of thing, or, other types of theories. So that's the first thing. The other thing that you bring up that's really interesting is that libertarians, again, don't have to be absolute libertarians. They can believe in degrees of freedom, and they can believe that liberation is a process, right? So you could imagine a person born in very, very bad circumstances who's pitiable, and who we could hope to change the circumstances to help them, but that their options of what they can choose are much more limited than a person who has been given a lot of um, you know benefits in life, or the benefit of a good education, or not starving, or things like that. This idea that everybody has the same amount of freedom is not necessary for a libertarian to believe. Again, I'm not trying to defend. I'm not a libertarian, so I'm not trying to say they're right about this. But I'm just noting that there are people in the determinism camp, and there are people in the libertarian camp who can agree with the idea that they're well. All right. So to be in the determinist camp, you think everything is determined. But to be in the libertarian camp, you can believe a great deal is determined. And that all you have to do is believe that it's possible for some people at some times to do things that are not determined, but not that every single person has an absolute degree of freedom at all times in every choice they make. Some libertarians think that, but not all do. As far as I'm of mixed feelings on this other one. I hate to say it. I don't know what I think on the topic. I'm not saying that. I'm saying this idea that every decision we make has heaven or hell as a consequence, and that's harsh and it weighs very heavily on us, and that there's something not very compassionate about a person who views other people's responsibility as that heavy, even though they may be viewing their own just as heavily. I'm not. We don't know, right? They could just be a jerk, but they might actually be, putting the burden on themselves before they think of it on anybody else, and they do it, more heavily on themselves, right? We're not trying to demonize this type of person, but what's funny is the two sides of the coin on that question, because the reason why we don't want to think that's the case is that it's a heavy burden, right? So, there might be something to the idea that that's a pretty harsh way to think. But in philosophy, one of the rules of logic is that we have to weigh arguments against what we desire, right? So if it's very painful for me to imagine that something is true, then I need to make sure that the arguments against that thing are extra, extra strong before I accept that it's not true, because I'm inclined to think it's not true, right? I'm just talking about the flip side of the coin, because I totally see everything you're saying on the other side, which is it's a pretty cold and heartless thing to go around saying, everything that happens, I'm taking into account nothing about the situation you were in, or how you were raised, or what bad things happened to you, or how hungry you were. I'm not thinking about that at all. You were free to do the right thing versus the wrong thing. Obviously, I'm not disagreeing with you on that. And that's a pretty cartoonish and cold way of looking at things that doesn't seem terribly wise to me. So I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying, on the flip side of it, the idea that my foolishness or my motivated out of bitterness actions could bring about hellish consequences is something I don't want to think. So therefore, I should have hard arguments it's not true before I give it up. In other words, I should be inclined to think it's probably true, since I'm inclined to disregard it too easily. Does that make sense? Again, I'm not trying to say to come to that conclusion. It's just a principle of thinking. Like, if I want this to be the case, or I want it not to be the case, then I can't use a little argument for it. I need even bigger arguments, because I'm already inclined to agree for not good reasons. I hope that isn't too much of a downer, but I think that's a good, serious philosophical principle, right? We're psychoanalyzing ourselves just as we're analyzing Paul Ray. What do you think?
No, I actually I think that's interesting. Because I also do see the flip side likewise, in that, while like giving too much weight to free will can be callous. I think also, giving too much weight to determinism, it can actually almost promote, bad behavior, because, now we're too soft with, people feel like they have too much leeway. And so I don't know, it's kind of like a balance where, I guess it gets back to that pragmatism issue, where it's like, in a way, it's kind of better for society. It might be like callous, but in a way, it might be better for society if we do have these assumptions of free will. And
Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think I don't know. I guess it's just a balance. Like maybe publicly assumptions of free will and privately understandings of determinism, something like that.
That's interesting. I was thinking the opposite formula, but yeah, maybe both. So here's something that just occurred to me. You said your friend was a Christian. It might be worth reminding this Christian about the principle of taking on the sins of the world onto one singular self. In other words, maybe what you should do is think about others as determined, and your own free will. That's your responsibility, right? You can't prove it to other people what you think is the case about you. So you take on the maximum amount of responsibility that you don't do anything wrong, and you give the maximum amount of grace to everybody else and say, well, let's do whatever we can to make the world a place where people are less inclined to do something bad, not only for each other, but for their own souls. That might be, since he's a Christian, it might be worth mentioning that Christ didn't go around pointing at everybody saying, you did this wrong and you did that wrong. He said, put all the sins on me, right? And if you're not having that attitude, you might not be a follower of Christ. And that might be a way for him to keep his own internal understanding about his own moral responsibility intact. And, Christ said, deal with the log in your own eye before you point out the splinter in your brother's eye, right? And so, yeah, I don't know. It's there might be some spiritual wisdom in his path, and you could maybe encourage him down that path even further if you think that his perspective is too much finger pointing in that way. That's just a thought.
Yeah, I'm not sure how far it will go with him. He's kind of stubborn, but it's worth a shot.
Well, I think that I thought a long time ago about how silly it was that Christians would try to drag Hindus into the Christian camp, and that Hindus would try to drag a Christian into their camp. And I thought, what everybody could do instead is just keep encouraging people to climb their own path, because if they're not taking the teaching seriously enough, that's the thing they care about. And they might get there might be some real valuable wisdom there. If you imagine it as mountains with a valley, it's like, well, you're a third of the way up the Christian mountain, and you're trying to pull people who are 2/3 up the way, the Buddhist mountain, down into a valley so they can be on your, no, you just encourage them to climb, and you encourage you keep climbing. So you might be able to encourage him to take the teachings of Christ seriously in those ways and see what his response is. Maybe he has a good response, but I think it's better because what I'm advocating is genuine. I don't mean to say, oh, pretend like his Christianity is legitimate and then trick him into thinking something like what you think. I mean, no, tell him, no, really, you're supposed to be a follower of Christ. Well, Christ took on the sins of the world, so how are you going to do that? And that would probably stick with him as something that he has to mull over for a while. And who knows? I imagine he might emerge as a moral hero after doing something like that. That doesn't sound like an easy task. Anyway, those are some random thoughts. I don't want to get too spiritual or deep or change the topic too much. I don't mind if you want to, but I don't want to go off on a tangent myself.
No, I just had one thought on the first point as far as deterrence and legal system. So I don't know how far out my thinking is on this, but I guess when I think about how an understanding of determinism could sort of reform how we think about justice or whatever, I guess the way that I'm thinking of it isn't so much the way that it's practiced now, which is, as far as deterrence goes, which is kind of like a reactive solution after the crime has happened. I guess what I envision as sort of a result of appreciating determinism would be like engaging the effects before they create, or engaging the
Sure.
causes before they create a cause or an effect. And so one of the
Dealing with murder by dealing with poverty before the murder happens, that kind of
right.
thing. Yeah,
Yeah,
gotcha.
exactly. Yeah, that kind of I guess that's sort of my vision, is sort of more of a proactive, but also just kind of like a general, and maybe it's being too generous with, the average person even thinking or caring about these things, but like I don't know, just a different way of looking at the world. Because as Paul states in his writings, like, we do have these assumptions of free will, and kind of underlies everything. And I don't know, I think it did get my noggin jogging, so to speak, thinking
Yeah.
of like what the world would look like if we didn't have these assumptions of free will. And I don't know. I don't know that the average person would view it the way I might. Maybe they would even handle it better than I might. But I just think that I would be, I don't know. I would want to like kind of engage the causes before they come effects, I guess.
Yeah, well, there's something really appealing about this perspective because it allows you to do that, right? If you have a sort of a radical libertarian view, what you say is, look, I'm trying to solve the problem of murder. Imagine we lived in heaven and nobody did anything wrong, and then one person chose to murder. How would we deal with that? It's like, well, we're not there. Okay. How about before we deal with that, let's deal with the things that might incline someone towards murder, and let's make a better society so it's less likely that people would be inclined to do it. And then after we've done all of that, or even at the same time as we're doing all of that, we can still answer the question, okay, but what about the person who does it? Do we need to put them in a box so they don't do it again because other people have a right to live and not be afraid of being killed and things like that? So you can do both at the same time. But the determinism, I think Paul is actually motivated by this as well when he's writing this. I think he's trying to get us to think in the way that you see as appealing here. And it makes sense to say, okay, look, get rid of the idea that you meet a person and their character might make them be whatever and do whatever. And then you actually could make it a lot less complicated if you thought about people and their actions the same way you think about physics and chemistry and stars and rolling objects. There are causes and there are effects, and that gives you a lot more that you could do to try to make a better society than just starting out with, well, who knows what's in the heart of man and what he might do next. At least it makes you not feel as impotent. You can start saying, well, there's things I could take care of. I could fight against disease, and I could fight against poverty. We could find effective ways to fix those things. And then, those are some of the factors that go into bad behavior and whatever. So I'm not saying I agree with it, but there's a huge amount of appeal there. Also, I'd say one of the strongest arguments for determinism is the one Scott Adams made the other day about this deterrent-based penal system. He said there would be no reason to punish anybody if their decisions weren't determined by what's likely to happen to them, right? Like, he's like, you think I'm getting rid of moral responsibility, and oh no, now the murderer couldn't help it, and so what will we do? He goes, no, the whole reason for arresting and imprisoning a murderer is to make other murderers think, oh, that's likely to happen, and then that'll determine that maybe some of them will be less likely to do it. And I'm not saying that's like a QED or anything, but it's interesting that the determinists have a legal moral punishment system that's actually pretty strong when you realize that they're arguing for what Paul Ray's arguing for here, which is that none of us are really morally responsible for anything, which not all determinists want to say that, because they emphasize so much what he's saying in this section here about deterrence-based penal system. But he clearly wants to say that. He clearly wants to say, you are forced to do everything that you choose to do by the Big Bang, and so it's not really your fault. We're going to talk about that more.
What about,
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, we're talking a lot about prison, kind of skirting around some issues here with prison reform and punitive punishment and these kind of things. I kind of feel like, if you look at the history of how crime, they used to hang people for, stealing horses in this country here, and places in the world where they chop off a hand for stealing. A lot harsher, both in some parts of the world and then also in the history of Western civilization as well. I feel like some of this predeterminization or determination, right, has already affected, I think, probably the penal system to where we don't, take people's lives as often, even for heinous capital murders and things like that. Whereas they used to just take it for stealing a horse.
Yeah, you make a really good point there.
So I think it already has, in some ways, at least relative to how we're discussing it here. I think that all this kind of thought has already had an effect. Some people don't have as much choice or don't have all the options as others, and so some things, their free will doesn't have the scope, let's say, of someone who has a lot more agency, resources, family, money, genetic advantages or whatever. So I think that some of this, I want to say bleeding heart or liberalism, but certainly the prison system has gotten a lot more liberal over the last couple hundred years. United States and Western civilization in general, I would say, and it's probably something to do with this.
I think it does. I think it does.
People do think more along these kinds of lines. He never had the best chance, or where back in the day, I think people were a lot more just black and white about things. More.
Yeah.
Harsher.
Absolutely, they were. And these types of ideas have had a major effect on what's in fad right now in legal theory. When the Constitution was written, it was a natural law theory that was operating. Largely, it was natural law theory. And natural law theory is not the same as what's operating today in the United States. And what's operating today is much more influenced by this type of rationality and rationalism than even the legal theory in which the Constitution was framed. And it's interesting, right? It's like, look at what a strong case we have for punishment of the criminal because of deterrence and things like that. And it's like, well, Path makes a good point. It would be a greater deterrent against stealing if you cut someone's hand off, but you didn't go in that direction. You went in exactly the opposite direction. And I think you're right, Path. I think it is due to the influence of these types of ideas to a large degree. I think your instincts there are dead on accurate.
Which doesn't really cover, that's not the sole purpose of punishment. We keep talking about different aspects of the punishment. Part of punishment, which you touched on earlier, is the need to protect society and keep it civil. Some of these people need removed, and I suspect that back in the day, people thought of these things more. He made a bad choice. Fuck him, we're gonna hang him. Kind of a thing, and free will, more of a free will stance, and people are generally more knowledgeable about. I'm beating a dead horse now, but
no, you're not, because there's something more there than
aspects of prison. There is removing the offender from society, putting them in prison. Scary bad things are going to happen. That puts a warning out. It's a warning to other people who might be inclined to act that way. But then also you got to protect people from the offender and allow them to live in allow law-abiding people to live in a law-abiding society and remove the criminals or whatever. It's different aspects of it.
Yeah,
and I think that people, when they talk about prison reform, they don't. A lot of the activists, I'll say, don't seem as inclined to protect society from, and it's just oh, he never had a chance. Very much predeterministic. You know, uh,
I
kind
think
of,
so.
and obviously some people have more agency than others.
So that was the other thing we pointed out. So libertarians don't have to believe in absolute freedom. They can believe in gradations, degrees of freedom, and doing things to liberate yourself. Liberation as a process of education and things like that that can get you to a place where you have more agency rather than less. Obviously, determinists believe in zero agency. They believe in that there's no such thing as a free choice. It doesn't matter how sophisticated your situation is. You're still determined by all of those sophisticated factors instead of more blunt ones. But what you're bringing up here, I think, is touching on something interesting, because it would have been very easy for people back in the day to say, look, we can't let horse thieves run around and choose where they sleep at night. We must put them in a jail cell. But as you pointed out, instead they hung them. And I think psychologically, the motivation had more to do with purifying the land from the evildoer. Okay, this was a very different legal theory than anything that Paul Ray would endorse, right? It's not a deterrent-based, it could be deterrent-based in the sense that you could say, look, the harshest punishment we can give is going to give the most deterrence for other people not to do this. But it's certainly not we have a rational argument for why we don't have to share the rest of the free space of our country with a person who acts this way. And so we'll do the minimum of what's necessary to keep them from harming others. Instead, it was, no, we caught the evil. Let's rid the earth of the evil. And that totally does not fit in with this type of thinking at all. I mean, so if Paul Ray is trying to get rid of one idea of blame, but keep another one, that might be the one he's trying to get rid of, right? He might be getting rid of the idea of you are an evil thing, and therefore, if we don't get rid of you, then God might punish us entirely or something, right? It's like, no, he got rid of something like that and said, well, there's still a rational argument for the murderer can't choose where he sleeps at night, and we get to put him in a cell. And that still works in Paul Ray's view. But what doesn't work is a kind of a blame that does seem to not really factor into the way current legal theory in the United States operates to a large degree. It's certainly not a popular way of thinking right now. And what's more popular is stuff that would fit in with this rationalist attitude of Paul's. I think you're both pointed that out, and I think you're both right about that. Okay, we're almost done. Let's look at section 6. It's his last section. And in it, he's going to address the question that Twilight brought up a second ago, which is, how can we even imagine thinking like this? Even if you're right, and while I read your arguments, Paul, I'm convinced of them, then I have to go live my life, and the illusion of free will just operates. How could I ever free myself from that illusion? And he has some advice on how we might be able to do that. So he thinks he's proven that moral responsibility doesn't exist, and now he's going to try to help us rid ourselves of this sticky and difficult to be rid of illusion. So it's impossible to assign blame or merit to effects. The actions of all men are always effects of events stretching back into the infinite past. The infinite past, and ultimately external to the man himself. However, our habit of assigning blame or merit to certain actions is strong. Our habit is strong and would be difficult to break, especially considering the fact that a man calculates that it will bring him less happiness to do so. Okay, so you notice he's not making it easy on himself. He's not saying, oh, this would be easy. Just change your mind and agree with me and life goes on. He's like, no, we have deep habits of not thinking that this is correct. And we think, right or wrong, that if we were to rid ourselves of our illusion of freedom, we would have a more miserable life. We wouldn't be as happy. So we're really not inclined to get rid of it in the first place. However, he says, we could pit habit against habit and perhaps break the chain of connecting merit and blame to the actions if every time we find ourselves doing so, we remind ourselves of the simple truths listed above. that this is an unreasonable thing to do. Through this habit, we may be able to break the other. So he says here's my argument for how you could do this. Of course, you're going to think that people are, blameworthy for what they do, but really it's their circumstances and it's their nature, and that they didn't pick either. And so it's all of that stuff taken together for why they acted the way they acted. And so what you need to do is catch yourself thinking the wrong way. And every time you do, reread in your head the first 5 sections of this essay of mine. And if you make that a habit, that habit will fight the other habit, and maybe we'll be free of this. He never addresses the issue of whether or not that would make us happier, but he does think it would make us more philosophically accurate or something like that. So now we're going to get into talking about all of this from Paul Ray. So quick question. Paul Ray must believe which of the following? All right. So when I word a question like this, what I'm probably going to do, I imagine, is give things that he didn't say and that he didn't not say. This is an implication question, right? So what we want to do is negate each of the choices that I give here and think, is it possible for him to believe the opposite of this? Because if it's possible, then he doesn't have to think it. He might think it. It might be very likely that he thinks it, but we're looking for the one that he has to think. Okay. Must Paul Ray think that a rational society would have no prisons and punish no actions because it would base its constitution on the truth about the world, which is that man's actions are determined? Does Paul Ray have to believe that there's no such thing as a reasonable punishment? No.
No.
Right. Right, exactly. Obviously not. Okay. If something is the effect of causes, it is the responsibility of the first cause and not any of the later causes, and not the most immediate cause.
I think that's the one. I'm leaning towards that. I mean, continue about that.
I think he has to think that. Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's the one. I think that's the. I mean, that sounds like something he would have to believe in, and he does not like. I remember he does not like the first. What was the term?
He doesn't believe in a first cause in the first place. He doesn't believe in a first cause.
But it seems like he'd have. I mean, it's logical that would be it. It seems to me. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, so he doesn't believe in a first cause, and he also doesn't believe in responsibility on any cause that is itself also caused. So he doesn't even believe in a first cause. So I probably worded that question badly, because he doesn't have to believe in it, because he doesn't believe in a first cause. But he also sort of just doesn't believe in responsibility at all, because I'm not responsible because it was caused. Well, then that means that that's responsible. No, because that was caused. But he always says it goes back infinitely. There's an infinite. Now, not all determinists believe this. In fact, most people don't believe this, and you don't have to believe this to be a determinist. But Paul believes, as Path rightly points out, that there's an infinite series of causes and effects that go back. And so none of them can have responsibility, since they're all themselves caused. It's a universal principle of causality. And so since he doesn't believe in a first cause, he can't believe the first cause is the only thing responsible for everything. So that's interesting. That's a good point, Path. All right. Must he think it is irrational to find some actions preferable to others because they are all determined? No, right? It is irrational to find some actions preferable to others. He says, no, we can agree. We can find one thing agreeable and something disagreeable, even though they're all determined. Okay. If you do an action, you feel correct in one moment, and then you regret that action later, this proves that you have moral responsibility, because you could have chosen otherwise, which you know in your regret. Obviously, he doesn't think that. He's been arguing against that. So I think Path is right. I think I'm wrong in the entirety of this, because the only one that's even close to correct is the one that says the only responsibility can be the responsibility of the first cause. But he doesn't believe in a first cause. He doesn't believe that people's actions are prime moving first causes, but he also doesn't believe in a Big Bang either. We keep using that phraseology because most determinists would, and that's fine. but he believes in an infinite series of caused causes. So this chain is not responsible for causing the next one because it was caused to cause it by the one before it, but that chain goes back forever. So he really has freed the cosmos of responsibility. Now, I wonder if that's a hat trick. I wonder if he can really get away with that, right? It's like your whole argument that I'm not responsible is that something caused it. Well, that means the responsibility's in that direction. But then he just says forever. The responsibility's over there. Oh, where over there? Infinitely far away, and you'll never get to it. Okay, so you don't really mean the responsibility's over there. You mean there's no responsibility. Maybe that's a very clever accomplishment of his, or maybe it's just a hat trick. Again, most determinists don't believe in an infinite series of past events like he does. He just happens to believe that. Okay. Does anybody have any thoughts on that before we move on? Because we're going to do some general discussion of the entire essay now. Welcome, Savad. It's good to see you here. All right. That Paul Ray guy's interesting, and he really has made a stronger case than maybe we thought could have been made at first. And we also seem to have some problems with him still. But let's keep in mind everything he's argued while we look at other positions and move forward with this exploration. All right, Paul does not argue that everything in the world is subject to the law of causality. All right, so I'm going to make an argument now. And then the point isn't that it's correct. The point is to argue against it. So I'm going to say, imagine somebody said, Paul does not argue that everything in the world is subject to the law of causality. He assumes it. And then he goes on to demonstrate that this law also applies to the making of our decisions. What do you think of that? Does he argue for a universal principle of causality, or does he just assume it?
I'd say it's more of I'd say some of it is kind of assumed. I don't, because he never really convinced me through his argument. So I don't. Does he attempt to? Yeah, some. But I'd say, like when he's talking about causes initially, it was my opinion that a lot of that was just seemed like reasons. I would use a different term with a different intention. But,
yeah, I'm not sure he even argues for it at all. I think his experiment in what we read was, let's assume it's true. This is what it would mean. And then he goes bravely and unflinchingly to find all of the consequences of believing that there's an overarching principle of causality to everything. I don't remember him making an argument for it. He just said, oh, that's how we think about physics. And look, I can think that way about animals. And then he asserts the same applies to the choices of people. And then he very philosophically and logically and consistently looks at all the consequences of believing something like that. But I don't remember him ever starting with, is it true that the only things that can happen are those that are sufficiently caused?
Right. Yeah, that's how I remember it too.
All right. So the next question is this. Is that assumption just a prejudice, or is that the only rational way to think in the first place? Right? Does he not need to make an argument for it, because it would be ridiculous to talk to somebody who believes that things can just happen without any cause? Is there any other way of thinking about the universe, or is Paul just being consistent with the only coherent way of making sense of anything? If you want to have a conversation to make sense of people's choices, you have to think rationally, or you're never going to get anywhere. And is that why he doesn't need to give us an argument for one of the oldest and best established philosophical principles, the principle of sufficient reason? I think Thales, basically the first philosopher, had implicit in his writings the principle of sufficient reason. If not, it was one of his two students. So the idea is like, do you really have to argue for that? If you agree that you can make progress rationally by having dialectic by having conversations with other philosophers to rationally understand things, and you think a fit subject for examination are the choices people make, can you have a coherent conversation if you don't believe in a law of causality? Sometimes things just happen. Doesn't that sort of end the conversation? Or is there a vocabulary for making sense of agency and liberty and choices that are not determined?
I guess he's more comfortable with just working from an assumption and not trying to, law of diminishing returns, trying to make the case to people who, that he would have to make a case to. I guess he's more comfortable operating with the assumption of the law of causality, if I have that correct.
Can we assume anything else? Could we negate his assumption and still be coherent in the way we talk about actions, people, and choices? Could we say, well, sometimes people just do things and they don't do them for any reason, or they're not determined to do them because of all the factors? If we negate that assumption of his, is there any reason to continue the conversation, or have we already just given up on the fact, given up with that negation? Have we conceded that there's no progress we could make in discussing this topic at all? Because
I kind of feel like the whole point of having this conversation, um, people might say that they believe exclusively in free will or determinism. Uh, I suspect that neither one of those is true for anybody. I don't see how anyone. I mean, people will say that they believe certain things, but then some of that is just for the sake of argument. I mean, to how could anyone think that everything is predetermined when that takes away a person's agency? And we know that some of the best results people get are from people who don't believe in fate and believe that they can go out there and make it happen. So we see it
well,
evidence in that now. But then also you got so if you have that form of an argument by some people or whatever that's totally free will, then you're obviously going to have people against that in some kind of way. But I don't. I'm very unconvinced how anybody could believe 100% one way or the other as if it's a light switch, a binary equation or something.
Okay, it's going to get worse than that, though. This is good job, by the way. Thank you for that. Here, it's going to get worse. I want you to respond to this, if you would, Path. You said if people believe in free will, they're in the category of people who are likely to have really great outcomes. Aren't you being a determinist? Aren't you giving a deterministic argument? Isn't your whole rationality about this that it will be determined that better things will happen if you believe this lie? You're not really arguing against Paul.
No, because some people will exercise their free will and have a terrible outcome. I'm not saying there's no risk to it or anything like that, or that mistakes aren't made. But
Well, sure, but our reason for believing in free will can't be just that it's likely to make us have a better outcome, can it? Maybe it can, but I'm going to ask
no,
you
I'm
to
not saying
defend that.
that should be a reason for. But well, yeah, I guess I kind of am. I mean, if you can see the evidence, if generally speaking, people who believe in free will uh, will take more chances and put themselves out more and push harder because less things are left up to fate, and they believe that more things are affected, more outcomes are affected positively by them being more proactive and making better choices. And if generally, and I think that generally people are more fulfilled thinking that, and also I don't think that. I suspect that people who believe in predetermination don't have as much fun in life and generally don't get. Now, I'm not going to do a big study on it. This is my
Sure. No, Paul agrees with
my
you. He
opinion,
says,
you know.
oh, Paul agrees with you. He says we all assume that we'll be less happy if we agree with the arguments I made. So he grants that you're probably, your instinct there is shared with many people, most people, and Paul recognizes that. So your position is one of two positions, and the first one is horrible and scary, which is you secretly believe determinism is true, and therefore we should shut up about it because it'll make for a worse world if we know the truth. So the truth itself is bad. Or second, your position is probably the most sophisticated position that we're going to read as we read other thinkers in the future, who basically say, no, take exactly what you said and add to it one more thing, which is that we can't actually know the answer to this question. And if you can prove that there's no way to know the answer to the question, then you open up the space for the pragmatism that says, well, let's look at the consequences of believing in determinism versus the consequences of believing in liberty, and figure out what the philosophical consequences, not just the consequences for our daily lives, but what else does it force us to think that we might find distasteful or we might find agreeable. So that's an interesting train of thought that you have there. I think you're going to like some of the guys that we're going to read in the near future. Go ahead. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. So then here's the next question. All right. What if the only rational way to talk about actions, right? I mean, because if it's not that we can make sense of people's choices rationally, because if we have to give that up by giving up this thing that Paul says, if you really hold on to it like I did in the last 6 sections, you'll realize that we have no freedom, this universal principle of causality. If you have to give that up to believe in liberty, then you also have to give up the philosophical conversation. You have to say there's no chance of making sense of people's actions because it doesn't follow rational laws. So the next question is, who says the universe has to be comprehensible to us? All right, maybe we have to assume it is if we're going to engage in philosophical inquiry. Otherwise, there would be no way of justifying trying to understand it in the first place. But why can we not ask if this is all futile? Because we are forced to be in error that the universe is comprehensible whenever we try to understand it, but we have no reason to think that it is. So that might be going a little bit meta on this entire question, but that's a painful question that's worth examining, right? It's the philosopher saying, "Why do philosophy?" Right? Because philosophers question everything. Go ahead.
Is that absurdism?
Well, it scarily opens us up to that possibility. We don't have to fall into absurdism necessarily, but what we're at least what's terrifying to us philosophers about asking that question is that it opens up the possibility that, okay, wait a minute, if I don't believe in the law of causality governing everything with people, now we're going to find new arguments for agency, and so maybe we're not going to be stuck in this position. But if we agree that Paul is logically consistent in his commitment to an assumption of causal, rational governance, of at least comprehending why decisions are made, and we have to negate that in order to believe in freedom, we could say, well, he didn't really argue for it. He just assumed it and then looked at its consequences. So then the question is, do we have to assume it? Well, if we don't assume it, doesn't that mean that we have to give up on the idea that we can actually make sense of anything? And then the question is, well, maybe we should give up on that because we don't have an argument for why everything should be sensible either. Which again is terrifying because the whole point of philosophy is to try to make sense of things in a sense. And so absurdism is one of the monsters lurking in the shadows there, although there are other ways of getting out of that problem, even if you go down that road, I think. It's possible that deductive reasoning, like making sense of things, is not the appropriate vocabulary for dealing with personalities and characters and agents, and that there's a different vocabulary or other vocabularies that are available to us that we can use to make sense of those things, even though they never are nailed down in a deductive, logical, rational way. Paul is being rationalist. He's saying, no, I've got it figured out. A, B, C, D, here it is. If you knew all these factors, if you had a map with all of the influences motivating you, you could see exactly why you did one thing or another. And it's like, okay, if you believe that, then that's what that would have to look like, but you don't have access to that. But then we can't just attack him for saying you didn't make the case, because we have to think, well, what's the consequences of us denying what you're saying? Well, to deny it means maybe, again, we're going to read some libertarians and they're going to make deductive, rational arguments. They're going to try to make the case in a very solid way, just like Paul is, some of them, for why we have freedom and why there is agency. But both of them agree on an awful lot. If we think Paul is correct and we don't find other problems with his arguments, then the only way to not agree with him would be to have to say, maybe human life can't be made sense of in the absolute kind of way that billiard balls bouncing on a table can be made sense of, right? They're not obeying laws in that sense. But to say that, we have to realize what we're taking on there. If we feel inclined to do that, we have to realize that we're taking on the fact that we don't then in the next breath get to say, I understand it all perfectly in a totally different way. It's like, no, you either have to find a problem with Paul's arguments, or you have to have a problem with his assumption. If your problem is with his assumption, that has profound earth-shattering impact if you want to remain consistent and not just forget it the next second and pretend like you can make sense of things in the kind of way that he wants to make sense of human actions. Does that track, or am I going a little bit off the rails here? That might not be that important a point to make.
Makes sense.
Let's see what we have here. It's too bad I answered this already. I wonder if I can. Okay. So, proposition. Paul Ray presumes that the law of causality rules every aspect of the universe, including human actions. He then goes on to offer an explanation of how that can be the case and why it seems like we are free when in fact we are determined. Here's the question I'd like you to answer. Each one of you, if you would check mark whichever responses seem to most nearly match your attitude towards his arguments and his propositions. He does make this presumption. However, it is the only presumption one can make about the universe if one wishes to understand it. If anyone wants to deny that the events of the world are always the results of causes sufficient to make them come about, then the universe would be absurd, or would have the potential for any absurdity at any time, and the entire project of discussing, arguing, and trying to come to understand it would be futile. So the position is, he does do that, but that's the only reasonable thing anybody can do if they want to be reasonable. The next position is, he is not presuming that the universe is always operating with a law of causality. He is demonstrating that it is. He is taking the events of the world, the seemingly free choices of agents, which make up the greatest illusion that the universe has a liberal element to it, and showing that this is not the case. Okay, so you can just deny that he was making an assumption and instead say, no, the entirety of the essay is an argument for the universality of the law of causality, right? We presume it in physics. He's showing how it's also the case in these other things, in the things that seem like free human choices. Or another response might be, he does make this presumption, and it is unjustified in his writings. While it may be impressive how consistently he follows the logical consequences of this presumption that he's making, if we do not like his conclusions, we can question this axiomatic starting point and wonder why he never felt the need to establish it before asking us to follow along, as if we consent to this article of faith to which he's always adhering. All right, maybe that's a fine position, but I think that there are consequences to that, right? The first one is, well, it opens everything up to absurdity. The third one is, Maybe it does, but he still didn't give me an argument, and maybe I've got better arguments, and so maybe there's no absurdity here at all. Another response might be, I share in his assumption, perhaps with his conclusions, but I feel his argument would have been much stronger if he had made a case for accepting it instead of simply expecting us to. Okay, so maybe we think that's a weakness in what we read, that he could have made the case better by first arguing for it. I'm not certain if there is a problem with this assumed starting point of his, or if there's a problem with some of his thinking, but I strongly feel that his conclusions are incorrect, and I wish I understood why so that I could argue effectively against them. That might be a way that someone's feeling. Or the presumption he makes is the entire trick of his essay. If you assume that the law applies to all things, then his just so story of how it applies to human choices seems compelling and helpful. However, one could do the opposite. Negate the consequent, you will see as effectively that the presumption which came before it is incorrect. If we look at effective arguments that people are indeed free in their choices, then we can conclude that a commitment to the idea that there's nothing in the universe free of determinism is an error. So basically, it's just saying, look, seems like a strong case, except it sets it up perfectly for if I can find another argument that really proves we're free, that would then show me that his presumption was a faulty thing to presume. Because he made the case so strongly. If there's a universal law of causality, there's no freedom. So if I could just find a different argument that proves freedom, then I can show that his presumption is incorrect. All right, so those are really not really discussion questions. They're just, if you go to the website and you fill out whatever, check any of those that you think accurately describe your response to what we've been reading here. It's anonymous, but it'll keep a tab of how we feel. And then as we read other arguments, some of them consciously written to argue with Paul Ray, we can see how our views evolve over the course. I'm gonna stop, and I'm gonna just open it up to anybody who wants to talk about it. So, let me add Path in here. We had a tech issue. So I'm gonna shut up for a minute, and I'm gonna ask if we can just generally discuss anything else that you guys find interesting here, and then believe it or not, I have a really fun philosophy thought experiment that's related to this Paul Ray essay that he didn't exactly talk about, but that I think came about because of some of the stuff. Anyway, we'll discuss that after. Is there anything else anybody wants to talk about? If we recap, what did he do here? So we know from before that he made the case that all human choices are themselves caused and determined, even though they're the cause of the actions that we take. And then he argued in this section, he argued that willpower and choices and all of those things, they're not really illusory. It's the fact that they're free that's illusory. They're one of the chain links. And yeah, sure, I made a choice because I wanted to. Why did I want to? Because I was determined to want to. So he's sort of just, that's the level on which he's making this case. And then today we looked at it and said, he says, the reason why it seems to us that we're free when we're not is that we're just blind to the things that go into making up why we want what we want. Or when it's very clear to us what's motivating us, we don't understand how each of those motivations weigh against one another and war against one another. And so we're ignorant of exactly how our desires were determined. And so we just presume, well, my desire is the beginning of the whole thing. And then he gets to the point for why he's making this whole argument, where he says, if you understand how true all this is, in section 5, he says, there's no such thing as moral responsibility. Whatever makes a person do what they do happened infinitely in the past. It's all outside of the individual ultimately. And so we can find things that people do agreeable. We could even find them admirable in a certain sense. We could find them disagreeable. We could even find them condemnable in a certain sense. But the actual idea of blame and merit is something we should be able to liberate ourselves from. Now that we've understood that it's really the circumstances, it's really your nature, that you didn't determine your parents, and you're just stuck being the domino that you are, and he wants to look at people as dominoes that are forced to fall when they're struck appropriately to fall. And, you know, he still has room for punishment. He still has room for blame and merit in a sense, but there's another sense that he wants to wipe it out. And it's in that sense that Path was talking about, this sort of absolute sense where you're the originator of the bad thing in the first place. And then he says, look, it might not seem possible for us to get rid of this idea of moral responsibility since it's so ingrained in us by habit, and since we imagine that we'll be less happy if we think of ourselves as not free. However, I've got a solution. Every time we catch ourselves thinking in that wrong habit, just rehearse in our minds the first 5 sections that we just read. Think through the arguments again. And if we make that a habit, we can pit habit against habit, and maybe we'll get rid of this illusion of ours. So now that we're done with that, and we've wrapped up talking about that, we've wrapped up reading it. I'm going to shut up and let's discuss it. Is there anything else anybody wants to say about this? This Paul Ray guy, this case of his. Is there something particularly impressive or disturbing that he said that I didn't touch upon? Is there something you were surprised he said that you didn't expect he would be making a case for? All right, we've beaten it to death. Feel free to interrupt if you want to say anything. Oh, Sivad went on mute. What's up?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little.
Yeah,
little
can you hear me? I'm sorry. You go ahead.
Oh, okay. I would say it's surprising. It's a little impressive and surprising how strong he feels about his viewpoint, considering, I mean, you can't prove that it is or it isn't just with free will. So, I mean, there's plenty of thought experiments you can go through and debate, but I mean, there isn't something that you can look to and say, look, this is the example of why determinism is the way, or hey, this is because free will is the way. So I'm surprised that he feels as strongly as he does, considering there's no absolute to it.
I feel the same way as you do, and I wonder if we're being unkind because maybe the libertarians and the determinists were living in a simpler illusion where they thought they could actually get the answer, and we're all living in a world where it seems to us that the answer isn't really a deductive thing that you can really get to that solidly. His commitment.
I was going to say I think the one thing that we have become, well, I guess I shouldn't generalize, that we have become aware of or more aware of is that we essentially create our own reality. So, you know, I mean, how we react in the lens we look through something is going to totally determine our approach or our actions. And have not lived it in that time. I don't know if that was. I don't know how adopted that viewpoint is.
So when you say we create our own reality, it sounds like you're saying that we play a creative role in being. You might be saying that we're just dreaming and everything we think is real is just made up by our minds, but I don't think that sounds like what you're saying. It sounds like what you're saying is you have an effect on.
Right. So I could be told, hey, I'm a victim. You're gonna, the odds are totally against you. You totally just, don't even try. Or I could look at it as like, all these odds are against me. I'm going to be the one to succeed. I'm going to be the anomaly. So it's that, right? So you can having that viewpoint, as Path was saying, of having that belief that you can make the change, or that you can make the difference, you are going to be proactive in, let's say, the life you're pursuing. You're going to make life happen instead of let life come to you. If you're going to go after something and let's say take it or burn it instead of just hope it comes your way.
Now, what would Paul's response to that be?
I probably would say, well, that's a cute thought experiment, but it's all determined anyway. So you can have the inner turmoil of, or belief that you can or you can't, and whether you do, it was already determined.
Well, right. So I think he might even be able to agree with you that if you have a certain attitude, it might lead to better results. He said, how fortunate that we've created a society where you are determined to believe that. That will lead to better things, but it's determined.
Right.
So in other words, a new question arises in our minds, which is, if we keep pushing him to be committed to this, does it reduce to a tautology? In other words, is it not really saying much at all? If he can take into account everything as determined, this determinism is a pretty weak general commitment to. It's like an article of faith. It amounts to little more than Zeus is the god above all, but there's no practical thinking about what that means and how we live our daily lives, because we still have to live them, thinking about how we model ourselves and go through the world. And so the more you bring up these objections, he can still keep giving the same answer. But even though he gives the same answer, I don't think it makes his case so strong. I think what it does is it just makes it such a general claim that nobody disagrees with, right? And it's just sort of like, it's tautological. It's saying like, well, to think rationally, you have to believe that things can be understood, or something maybe not quite equal to that, but as general as that.
What's interesting is, let's say, looking at your past, you'd say, oh, it all makes sense looking backwards. In other words, it's almost like a deterministic point of view, but in the present, it's like we like to think or believe that we have free will.
It's interesting because we think about the future that way too, right? Your whole attitude is, if I make this decision, I'll determine the future. Wait a minute, what? I thought you were arguing against determinism. Oh, I'm going to get married and I'm going to have a kid and I'll make the future be something. It's like, well, how are you going to make the future be anything if that kid is totally free and you have no right? I thought you were going to make a nice environment. You were going to help the kid get a good education. Aren't you determining the future? Isn't that all of your hope is bound up and wrapped up in Paul being right? Right? In a sense, I'm not saying that he wins the day here, but you see,
no,
see
right.
what I mean?
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely.
So then I would say one of the weakest things, and most determinists don't actually have the same emphasis Paul has on this. One of his weakest things, it seems to me, is his whole the consequences for moral responsibility thing. In other words, somebody could agree with let's call it weak determinism and hard determinism. Or no, let's not do that. Let's call it because that already refers to something. Let's call it the weak law of the general law of causality and the absolute law of causality, something like that. And we'll say, look, we believe generally in the law of causality, but it's this very general principle. It's not telling me really important things about whether or not anyone's morally responsible for the murder they committed. It's just telling me that things can be understood rationally, something like that. Whereas Paul does something further than even a lot of other determinists do, which is he says, no, I'm going to be consistent. I'm going to really stick to what the consequences of this idea are. And what they lead me to is the idea that I'm wrong when I think somebody is bad. Somebody is the source of badness. They're just another domino. and they can't help it, and so they're not the thing I should be hating. I can find them disagreeable, and I can find their actions detestable, but it's not their fault, is really what he wants to say. And I think you can be a determinist and not agree with that. Here's an example. Actually, let's defend his position there. We'll understand it better if we argue for it instead of against it right now. So let's imagine that there's two ways of looking at the criminal. One way is to look at him like a crocodile. If a crocodile comes into the village and eats a child, none of us are happy about the crocodile. Most of us are like, let's get some spears and let's go kill the fucking crocodile, right? We all agree crocodile's bad. We got to get rid of the crocodile. But Paul would agree with that, right? We could be determinists. We could be a tribe of determinists who say we must rid ourselves of the wicked, evil crocodile that threatens to eat more children and is eating people. Are you getting pulled over?
No,
It sounds like
they're just going outside.
Ambulance or something. That's okay. Okay, so we could agree with all of that. However, we could be blind to something that Paul understands and go further than that. We could think of the crocodile as a robot that has to eat and is triggered to eat the child because the child looks delicious to him. And we can hate the crocodile because he's like that, because he's constituted that way, and we want to get rid of him because for obvious reasons. And that would all be fine. Or we could go further. Like Paul could go that far with us, but then we could go further and say that thing is evil, not because I don't like what it's programmed to do. It's like the source of badness, and there would be no evil in the world if it weren't for creatures like that bringing evilness into the world. And Paul would say that's a philosophical delusion. That you haven't thought. The crocodile is just a robot. The crocodile can't help wanting to eat. He can't help finding things tasty that he finds tasty. And you can get rid of the crocodile, and you can do it with passion, and you can be angry that he's there because your anger will help you to kill him. And all of that's fine, but don't believe that he's anything other than the robot that he is. And all Paul is saying is think of the murderer the same way. You can still imprison him. You can still oppose him. You can still try to make it less likely that other people will be motivated to act the way he acts by punishing him harshly. But don't go further and think that the world was heaven until this evil monster came into it, because he can't help being what he is.
What about from the standpoint on, saying everything is predetermined, but there's certainly examples of, look, your environment.
Examples of what?
Sorry. You're a product of your environment. If you have, let's say, an environment, you have two groups, and you tell one that they're really smart and the other one that they're victims. The one group you tell is going to succeed are more likely to succeed, right? So what about from that standpoint that, look, he's saying it's all predetermined, but we've been able to establish that environment is a huge impact on is a huge impact on the result.
So this is really interesting, because there's a debate between the determinists and the compatibilists on exactly this issue.
Hold on, I can't hear you.
Yeah, we were having trouble hearing you, but we made out what you were saying. I don't know if you can hear us now, but it got a little tricky for a while. You should focus on your driving. We don't want you to crash. You should focus on driving, and we'll.
It's all predetermined anyway. Don't worry about it.
No, it's because it's determined that you have to care about the factors that go into it. That's the whole
Sorry.
debate. No, that
I'm
was
having
right,
fun
Pat.
with these dumb jokes.
No, that's the whole debate. That's the whole debate. Is it all predetermined, so it doesn't matter, or is because it's predetermined, or because determinism is true, that's why you have to care about the factors. I'm hoping that Savad will drive home, and then we'll see him for the after show or before.
Yeah,
we close this out.
certainly want him to get home safely or wherever he's trying to get.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah. Okay, so we're just starting this whole conversation. We're starting it with this hard determinist, and he's doing a great job of opening up the conversation and making us really think about things. And we're going to definitely be keeping in mind all of his arguments as we look at other positions, right? When the libertarian's arguing that we have agency, it's going to be because we read Paul that we have lots of objections, and that we're going to need to see if he really makes his case and all of that. What Savad was bringing up, I think Path brought up something similar, and maybe even Twilight. I'm trying to keep track of how many times. But in just this discussion, it was hinted at by at least two of you, which is this idea. Well, there's this debate between the hard determinists and the compatibilists, because what the compatibilists say is, look, okay, determinism, yeah, but what's determined? Well, what's determined is a bunch of things that go into determining things, and some of those things are internal to us. And so I can agree with the determinism principle and realize that out of that system, there's a kind of moral responsibility and agency that can emerge. And we haven't gotten to the compatibilists yet. We're just looking at the determinists. But you guys have, Savad, hi. We think you should drive safely and get home, and we'll.
Oh no, I'm good, man. I'm in traffic. So.
Oh, okay. All right.
But I appreciate the.
Well, be careful. We won't end it. We won't end it if you leave. We'll wait until you come back if you get home. But in any case, so Savad, you brought up something that Path was hinting at earlier, and I think maybe Twilight as well, which is there's a debate between the compatibilists and the hard determinists. And it's right on this issue that you guys are hinting at. You were hinting at some pragmatism earlier too. So you're really predicting a lot of the people that we're going to be reading in the upcoming sections. But what these compatibilists do is exactly what Savad was saying, which is, okay, look, I agree, it's determined, but what's determined? Well, some of the things that are determined are thoughts that are very powerful for changing what's determined in the future. And there's things that are internal to ourselves that are a part of this chain of determining things. And so even if I don't disagree with you, Paul, in determinism, I agree completely with determinism, I still think that in that system, agency, moral responsibility, and as Daniel Dennett calls it, second-tier volitions, there are things that can emerge in that system that would allow for the proper vocabulary to describe it as simply an agent is acting. You know, the things that determined my actions were the things around me and my nature, and also some of the environmental factors that went into my decision are actually internal to me. They're not really in my environment. They're a part of my character, which was determined, but still is one of the factors that's going into these decisions. And so it's this debate. The compatibilists say that, and the determinists say, no, those things are all determined. And then the determinists say, yeah, but what's determined? It's something that's internal to myself that's a part of what's going into determining future things. And so I got my freedom even while I didn't negate determinism. So when you bring up the idea that, well, if a person is taught a really bad idea that makes them feel like they're a victim and they can't change anything in life, they will be more likely to be a victim who never changes anything and is suffering and miserable. However, if they're taught, even if it isn't true, that they have agency and the ability to change things, then they have a better shot of actually trying things that will lead to a better world for themselves and others in potentia. And so that's sort of hinting at a few things, but one of the things it's hinting at is a debate between compatibilists and hard determinists. who say, who look at things like that and try to come to have their cake and eat it too at the same time. So I think that's interesting. It's the other thing that was being hinted at earlier in the conversation was a kind of pragmatism, which I'm surprised at how instinctively ahead of the program you all are on this. It's really fun. But I think Twilight and Path both brought up the idea that it seems unlikely that, if Paul isn't making a solid deductive argument, it also seems unlikely that the libertarians will be able to. And maybe this is the sort of subject that isn't susceptible to a hard conclusion like that. Therefore, let's start looking at the pragmatic life effects of believing one versus the other, but also maybe the philosophical pragmatic effects of what else do I have to believe? And do I find those things to be agreeable or distasteful to me? Or can I use other ways of judging things that I'd be forced to believe? I don't want to jump the gun or anything, but we're gonna get to James, who's gonna make that case really well. First, he's gonna prove that you can't actually have a solid answer for either side of this. But what's interesting is that Paul Ray brings up this idea of, I was determined to act, and then the next day I was determined to regret my action. And William James says, if that's the case, then either the universe is regrettable, it's determined to be regrettable, and we should be nihilistic about it, or my error that I regret something is regrettable because it's an error. So there's something regrettable about being that I don't want to say. I don't want to say that the universe, it would be better if it didn't exist than that it does exist. And so because I'm disinclined towards nihilism, now that's not the end of the conversation, but he's going to be making a case on exactly that issue that Paul brought up. I'm sorry, Savad, you unmuted yourself. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to make a comment. I was determined to make an action, and then the next day I was determined to regret it. I said, like, we all haven't been there before.
Yeah. Well, so, hard determinists sometimes are, well, why should there be anything like regret? Why should the universe be constituted in a way where it will determine X and then also determine that we regret X afterwards? Let's see. Gotta bounce. All right, Twilight. We'll see you later, man. All right, so we're gonna end it there. There's a bonus thing on the website called Buridan's Ass. Path, if you want to stick around, we'll talk about it in the after show, I guess. But it's a bonus for people taking the class or people on the website. Have you heard of Buridan's Ass before?
I have not.
I have not.
Okay. So what we'll do is we'll end the class on Paul Ray right now. We're going to go to the after show and we'll talk about, this is a famous philosophical thought experiment. And so we'll discuss that in the after show. All right.